Hello, folks. Rob Goller here, and happy Election Day. If you're watching live, it is Election Day. If not, I hope you voted. I hope you took that responsibility. Um, I did talk about election days last year. I've been doing these videos for more than a year now. We've hit our first anniversary. So what I did is I was getting some questions about things that I did answer in last year's video. So I thought it'd be a great idea to just repost it. So if you didn't catch that, feel free to do that. It's in the on the YouTube page and also in the Facebook. Uh, uh, I posted it on Facebook, and so you should be able to find that. Today, I want to talk about something that popped up as I was doing research, and it kind of surprised me a bit. Reminded me, I think, more so of how history does repeat itself, or at least, as we say, rhymes with the past. What current day things that are happening rhyme with what's happening in the past. And I was going through newspapers as in the town historian's office as I was doing some research. And we had a newspaper in East Aurora. Well, first, what I hear often is that the politics of today, especially with everything that's going on, Democrats and Republicans, that the party politics, especially what's going on in Washington and with the presidential campaign right now, um, is that and since probably the past decade, a lot of people say since Trump was elected, but it does go before that. It's just they use the word tribalism, where Democrats and Republicans are loyal to their parties and their candidates, and that the opposition is seen as, in some cases, the enemy, and that it's hard to come and find common ground when there's this political tribalism, both in Washington D.C., in Albany, and even in our small little towns like East Aurora, where you see on social media. And on the news, you'll hear all the time that it's unprecedented, that we haven't had this kind of divisiveness um, in our politics before. Well, some of the things that are happening are unprecedented, like a former president being indicted and on multiple counts and is appearing in court right now on a civil case. Um, we have not seen that kind of thing before. And the fact that he is running for president again, that sort of thing. Um, so some elements of it are unprecedented. But one of my favorite historians, Heather Cox Richardson, will say, and a little shout out to her, she's just written a book about the current political situations and how it relates to the history, the past, and she does a great job of doing what a lot of historians should be doing, is relating present day things to what happened in the past and vice versa. So highly recommend her. But what she would say is that, yeah, this has happened before. This is not nothing that's happening today, at least a vast majority of the things that are happening today have happened before. And she'll point to the early 1850s, when our good, East Aurora's very own Millard Fillmore was in the White House, um, and the divisiveness of that period of time, as well as the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, after the Civil War. And so that's where this comes along. So the reason why I'm talking about this today is we feel today that there's this political divisiveness, and that it's unprecedented. So Republicans are in their camp, Democrats are in their camp, and there's very little discussion and overlap. So I was you start to think that, right? You hear it in the media, you hear it on social media over and over again, and instead of discussing issues many times, they're just talking about the game, and it's sort of like a football game where you have two teams, and one is going to come out as the winner, and one is going to come out as the loser, as opposed to the issues where we're discussing where common ground can be found, the pros and cons of issues, debating the issues. So we sometimes feel like it's that game of Democrats versus Republicans, and we're forgetting about the issues. And that for some reason today, this is the first time we've ever had this problem. Well, it's not. And we know this, but sometimes we need to be reminded of it. So the Weekly Times was a newspaper here in the village of East Aurora, and it was actually published at the west end of the village, which was known as Willink at the time. And it was the East Aurora Advertiser, which still publishes, of course, had been around since 1872, and lots of other newspapers had come along, and including the Weekly Times. Now, the Weekly Times, which I found funny, on the front it says an independent local newspaper. However, as I was going through the issues, and we're trying to get them digitized, and it only lasted about a year and a half, 2 years, this small little newspaper at the West End. But in November 4th of 1880, November 5th, excuse me, having trouble seeing the issue, November 5th of 1880, and I posted this, and I'll repost it, I'll share it, on the Aurora Town Historians page, and then it went on the other historical pages. It was shared to there. Was yesterday's post. Is this front page? And the Weekly Times said, "The elections, a sweeping Republican victory, a solid North, the president and both houses of Congress Republican, and here it comes, the enemy annihilated." I was shocked, but again, just reminded that we, we think we kind of romanticize the past, right? And we think people never acted the way we are doing it today. Like we think maybe the political opponents are often characterized as the enemy in some circles, in the politics of Washington, that sort of thing. And this was used in a headline here in our little village to report the result of an election in 1880. Now, this election was really important. This was the first election after Reconstruction, and Garfield won the White House, but it was the closest election we have ever had in the United States, popular vote-wise. Now, Garfield won by quite a bit in the Electoral College, but he won by less than 10,000 votes in the election of 1880. And it was this followed the election, the famous election, and you probably studied this even in high school, middle school and high school history classes, the Hayes-Tilden election that actually went to the House of Representatives. There was a compromise of what they called 1877, where just a few days before the inauguration, which then was in March, even though Tilden, who was from New York, he was a Democrat from New York, had won the popular vote. He had about 4.3 million votes to Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the Republican. He had about 4 million and change. So it was still a close election, but Tilden won the popular vote. But there were several states in the South and that there was controversy over the votes, and so the votes weren't certified, and so they got to the point where they were going to certify the election in Washington, and the states had competing electors, and so there was a lot of back and forth. They actually claimed that there was fraud in the election. So they weren't going to send, and you had competing people in the states certifying the electoral votes, certifying the election, and then certifying the electors that would be sent to vote for the president. Does it sound familiar? Yeah, and and so there was even a case where they were asking the vice president to step in. Sound familiar again? So that part of the history has repeated itself. Well, long story short, and you can read about it, is online or in the history books, because it was such an important election, the election of 1876, that they came up to it with a compromise that Rutherford B. Hayes would win the election. So he got 185 electoral votes to Tilden's 184, even though Tilden probably not only won the Electoral College, but also the popular vote, in exchange for a number of things, one of them being ending Reconstruction in the South. So this sets up the context for 1880 in this headline I was talking about in our local weekly newspaper. And so for the next 4 years, you had Democrats claiming, especially in the South, that the election was stolen from them. Sound familiar? Yeah. And so for the next 4 years, there were investigations. The Democrats were trying to claim, even though there was the compromise, that there were shenanigans in the election, claiming that Hayes wasn't the legitimate president. You get the idea, because we're living it today in a little different context. There was actually a certification or a compromise of the election results. And Tilden actually did probably win the election that year, but they were upset, and it set up the election of 1880. So the reason why even though it sounds very divisive, that the language of the enemy annihilated being used in a headline of the newspaper. Now, even though the Weekly Times here in East Aurora claimed to be independent, absolutely a Republican slant if you read the headlines in the newspaper results. So their coverage of the election was very slanted, and so a national issue coming down here to our small town. And so if you were to look at, and if you go to, say, the Wikipedia page for the election of 1880, North-South divisions continued, and it was solidified in the election of 1880. South being Democrat and the North being Republican, when you count the votes of the states and the electoral votes. If you look at a map, and if you go to the Wikipedia page for the election of 1880, there's a map of the electoral votes. It would look as if the North was all Republican and the South was all Democrat, and it stayed that way for a bit, for several years. Actually, the no Republican candidate until Harding in 1920 would carry a former Confederate state. So the South was now Democrats and Republican Party has evolved, so they were different back then. But so the Democrats started their hold in the South in this 1880, and the Republicans in the North. So if you were to look at the map on Wikipedia, you would think the North Republican, South Democrat. But we forget this. So it lends itself to thinking there's this political tribalism that that the one side, the North and the South, just didn't get over the Civil War. But there were lots of people in both the North and the South that voted the opposite way. And so I've done a lot of research into elections here in the town of Aurora. And one of the things when I was bored and had some free time several years ago is I was just curious at how the town of Aurora has voted for president. And I was able to go back to 1876. And in most cases, all but 3, the town of Aurora has voted for the Republican, including the election of 1880. So according to the results in the newspaper, James Garfield, the Republican in 1880, received 424 votes. And remember, it was just men voting back then. And then, so 424 for James Garfield to Winfield Hancock in 1880, the Democrat, received 264. Well, yeah, 424 to 264, not close. However, 264 votes is quite a lot. So if you were just looking at a map, you would think that here we are in the North, and it was North-South, and we would have voted for the Republican if you were just looking at a map. The point being is there's a lot of this whole political tribalism and this political divide, I think, is exacerbated by these maps that we look at. So you'll look at a map of New York State, and it'll just be completely painted blue. Um, but there are huge swaths of New York State that tend to vote Republican. So you look at counties outside of New York City, and Buffalo and Rochester, the more rural areas tend to vote Republican. And you'll look at them, if you look at a map of New York State, you'll see a lot of red. Now remember, people vote, not geographic areas. Um, but within those communities, there are other trends. So you might see a map of Erie County that's painted blue because that's how they've done the map. They'll do it by county. Well, within Erie County, we know there are towns that tend to vote Republican. So it would be red within this big blue swath of Erie County. Within our towns, there's definite differences too. For years, Aurora, where the village of East Aurora and the town of Aurora were called a Republican town. Again, like I said, all but 3 presidential elections tended to went toward the Republican candidate for president. Um, a couple times it was a third-party candidate that did it, though. Woodrow Wilson actually won the most votes in 1912, but that was just because Theodore Roosevelt was running on a third line, and he took votes away from Taft, who was the Republican. So sometimes it wasn't that the Democrat was more popular; it's just the Republican vote got split here in the town of Aurora. But the village within the town tends to vote Democrat and has for decades. But and it's been sort of a back and forth. So if you could say 60% to 40%, 60 to Republicans, 40 to Democrat for years in presidential elections. Sometimes a lot more slanted toward Republican. But my point is that a lot of times we paint these maps, and even with our small towns, and we don't we don't dig down into the deeper election districts or the towns and the villages to see that there's this, it could be 51-49, and the town would get painted a particular color because of the 51%, but there's still quite a few people who voted the other way. And so the election of 1880, if you were to look at the Wikipedia map and see the Republicans dominating the North, and read the headline of the Weekly Times, you would think you'd get this impression, because it was exaggerated, that everybody here in the town of Aurora would have supported the Republican, because they referred to the Democrats as the enemy, the Southern Democrats. Well, so the media there created this tribalism, the Democrats and Republicans, and the game, the horse races they call it. And so, we hear in modern times with social media and television and cable news that they perpetuate this horse race. Well, this has been going on since the 1800s, so it's not anything new. And that one headline is symbolic, is emblematic of what was happening at the time, even in the 1800s. So this political tribalism has been happening. So one of the things we forget is that that we had parties, and the third parties were also played a big part of it. So in the town of Aurora, you had Democrats, and actually right after the election of 1880, the Democrats did very well in local town elections. Actually, the 1880s was the last time we have a Democratic majority on our town board. For the past 2 years, it was the first time. I wrote about that. But since the 1880s, and in the 1880s, we had a Democratic town board. So there was also a difference between local politics and national politics sometimes. But if you were also to look at some of the media reports of the James Garfield election in 1880, you would think that the Civil War was still going on and people were still holding that grudge over the Civil War, when in fact there were a lot of other issues that were being debated. Immigration, the gold standard. There was actually a third party that greenbacks about the money during the Civil War that they had actually put more money out, greenbacks bills, than we had gold and silver for. So there's arguments about issues that a lot of Northerners might have supported. There were a lot of religious and ethnic reasons that people voted for one party or another, and didn't that didn't matter if you were North or South. So there were a whole lot of more complicated issues than what the headlines of the newspaper would make you believe. Simply calling the Republican newspaper calling the Democrats the enemies really simplifies a very complicated situation. Does this sound familiar? This is what is happening today, I think. There are a lot of issues that I think are getting lost. There's polls now coming out about the presidential election that's a year away. And I still don't understand, historically speaking, as a historian, polls aren't very good. We have had several elections in the last few cycles where the polls were just dead wrong. But the news keeps hyping these polls, and it's all about the horse race. So we're still doing it, and we're not learning our lesson about it. So you're not hearing a lot of policy necessarily, but the point being that the 1880 headline, which I will put in the comments, sounds awfully familiar to today, and how the news is covered. So when you hear people say, "Oh, the news is hyping this up," or they're one-sided, that's not new. And not covering the issues, they're covering the race, the people, and the personalities instead of the issues. That's not new. In fact, the newspapers of the 1800s, early 1900s, they were usually an arm of the political party. Even in local towns, even our small local town, you had newspapers that were pushing certain political candidates. They made no qualms about it. They did not hide it. Front page of the newspaper, not an editorial, not an endorsement. It would endorse right on the front page, completely ignore the opposition, or they would talk about the opposition in bad terms and talk about the candidates they were endorsing in good terms. So the political tribalism was there, and it was perpetuated by the media, even on our local towns in the 1800s. And so much so that I think we forget that there were, even though lots of Republicans in our town, there were also a large chunk of the electorate was Democrat. And that happened throughout the years. So to paint our town or any village, one color or another, it does not help us in the study of the history and the dynamics of our politics and our issues throughout the years. So my advice is, when you're looking something up or you're reading something about this, dig in deeper. Don't just look at the maps and the colors. Dig into the issues and look at the vote totals. See how many people were voting in the minority. You might be surprised. Another thing that gets lost, and this one is close to home for me, are the non-Republicans and non-Democrats. I am not affiliated with a party, and I'm very proud of that. And actually, I joked. A couple of my friends are, come from a long line of Republicans or a long line of Democrats. I come from a long line of blanks. And that's the term, and I don't like it. That's the term they often use for people who are unaffiliated with a political party. They call you blank. And it makes it sound like you don't know what you're doing. And oftentimes some people joke that, or not even joke, they'll say it maybe seriously, that if I'm not a Democrat or a Republican or affiliated with a party, I often get, well, you don't get to vote in the primary. And they act like that you're not really paying attention, that you can't make a decision, that you're politically uninvolved, that you just, you're blank. So you're not involved intimately in politics. You're not following things, which I find funny, because if that were true, I would wonder why all the political parties and the candidates, I'm getting inundated with texts and phone calls and flyers in the mailbox in the days before the general election. If I were so uninvolved, why are the candidates and the parties tripping over themselves to get my attention. We vote. Then the unaffiliated folks vote. And actually, I was curious and I looked it up. There are in Erie County, the Erie County Board of Elections has it right on their front page. There are 283, almost 284,000 registered Democrats in Erie County. There are about 156,664, so about 156,000 Republicans. So 284,000 Democrats, 156,000 Republicans, 15,000 or so conservatives, 3,700 working families. And then there's a category called other. And I went to the New York State Board of Elections and they actually split out the so-called blanks, unaffiliated folks, and other minor parties. The Erie County Board of Election puts them all together. But other is 162,518 unaffiliated voters, and very minor party lines, 162,518. If you count that, that's more than the Republicans. It'd be the second largest party in Erie County. So if the unaffiliated voters, the blanks, had their own party, they would be the second, or pretty close to it, the second most popular, most enrolled party in Erie County. Of course, that defeats the purpose of being unaffiliated. We wouldn't ever do that. My point being is that as we study history, we often study it even on the local level, Democrat and Republican, and I'm even as guilty of that. Writing articles about the last time we had a Democratic majority and the Republicans on the town board, how people voted in presidential elections, and I'm putting it in terms of Democrat and Republican and even prohibition and socialists and other parties that have come along over the years. But forgetting about those folks that aren't necessarily part of a political party. And that even goes back to before we had a board of elections and things like that. We had town meetings where the parties would actually go off into their own corners to nominate town board members and town supervisors. And I've been forgetting over the past several years as I've been thinking about elections history, and I'll admit this, forgetting those folks who are not affiliated with a party. So in this political tribalism, when you're reading the newspapers of the past, late 1800s, all the way through the 20th century, there's probably, I would guarantee it, a large chunk of people who vote, who are independent, who are non-affiliated, that probably determine a lot of elections. So we have to think in those terms too. You never see the gray area on a map. How many people, how many of the unaffiliateds were voting, and they often determine the elections. So there is we often think of the Democrat-Republican in terms of Democrats and Republicans, but we often forget the unaffiliateds throughout history, not just today, but elections in the 1880s, 1890s, and how they played a role. And so much so that it's interesting to look back. Someone actually asked me about the term, and I'll end with this, the term split ticket. And you used to vote, and even in town elections here, they mentioned it in the advertiser, in the election coverage of the town meeting. You'd have a ballot box, and there'd be a color ticket, usually color-coded, but a ticket for the Republicans, the Democrats, prohibition candidate, and it would have all the candidates listed. And you would simply, if you just wanted to vote Republican or vote Democrat or vote prohibition, you'd take your ticket and put it in the box. The idea of split ticket is you didn't want to vote for, you wanted to split your vote between candidates of different parties. You would split the ticket, figuratively. Often you would physically do it, but that's so today when we say you've split the ticket, you voted for people of different parties for different offices. So the term comes from splitting the ticket and voting for two different parties, going back to the 1800s. So that's sort of an indicator in the old newspapers when you're looking up, when the advertiser would talk quite a bit about the number of split tickets that were in the ballot box. And that would be an indicator that people were thinking independently, that they weren't being just voting. And don't want to say blindly, because some people probably did vote Republican, Democrat, Prohibition, because they actually wanted to vote for all those people. But some people just blindly would vote. They're a Republican, they're voting for the Republicans. But the number of split tickets was often mentioned in the newspapers in the late 1800s and through the early 20th century, of because you could tell. It wasn't just a tally at the end when they counted the votes; they knew how many tickets were split, and that would be a good indicator of people who were more independent, probably maybe not a member of a political party. And so that did happen as well. So I think a lot of times we need to be looking at that, and we don't. That lends itself to the tribalism that the media often contributes to, that we do on social media, but also historians tend to do it too. And we look in terms of the political parties rather than delving deep into the issues and what people are thinking. Because a lot of times, not everybody agrees with everything one party's doing or everything another party is doing. They actually look at the issues. And sometimes I think we don't give voters enough credit for doing that. We think they're just Republicans or Democrats. And what are Republicans thinking? What are Democrats thinking? Well, no, what are people thinking? And what are the non-affiliated people thinking? Doing that is harder, both covering the news and looking at history. And here in the local elections too, it'd be so much easier just to look at what the Democrats and the vote tallies, Democrat versus Republicans, but it's often much harder to look and dig deep into the issues. And so I think we need to do a better job of that. But so we don't fall into the trap of thinking that this political tribalism is a new thing in the last 10 years. It's been happening since the 1880s, at least, probably well before that. But here in our town, that headline from 1880 really was enlightening as to how far back these feelings go. And it does go up and down. It's actually, I've noticed that too, where you've noticed that too. We're not getting presidential elections tend to be close. We tend to be divided. We're not getting the Ronald Reagan 1980 and 1984 elections. And it may go back that way, and it does cycle. But this idea of very close presidential elections and the political tribalism that comes from it is not new. So, well, thank you for listening. Thank you for all of your comments. I really appreciate the feedback I'm getting on these videos and the research that I've done. Keep the comments coming. Keep the ideas coming. A really good sign is that I have way more suggestions for topic ideas than I have time or weeks to do this. So thank you so much. Again, put your comments in either in the comments or send me a private message. I'd be glad to answer both ways. And again, thank you for keeping history alive. And if you haven't done so, and if you still have time, go vote. Thanks. See you next time.